Water effects for your manga. Here's a couple of inking and toning techniques you can use to indicate the fluid forms, shadows, and reflections of water for your backgrounds. To start, let's draw a simple wave and break it down into simple shapes. A wave looks like a triangle with more active waters, while more serene waters has more rounded ripples. You can also simplify it as a squiggly. Pretty simple so far. Diving deeper into style, I always liked how Japanese and Eastern art use negative space to dictate the composition, especially in art like ukiyo-e. This concept of negative space has largely carried over into black and white manga over colored Western comics in the use of inks, tones, and the lack thereof to suggest objects. Now that we have the basic shape, we can imagine the shape in 3D and draw a water surface using our first method of blocking of the shadows of the various triangle or round clumps of waves in relation to our light source. This is similar to how a painter fills in shapes based on the blocks of silhouettes of colors he sees in a picture, but we have the task of doing this with only black and white. When we repeat these blocks, we want to vary our lines as much as possible to give a natural feel to it with a sense of randomness, so you may want to change the different shapes as they stack on each other. Lastly, make the shadows and objects larger in the foreground and thinner in the background to give a sense of depth. I use a thick brush in the front, but then very thin lines in the back as the waves get more sparse and disappear into the sunset. Let's try another way of drawing some calm water, but with hatching. This first way of hatching still relies on using patterns of squiggles and dots to make waves. But in this method, we're focusing on the reflection of objects to indicate the shadows on the surface of the water. Here, after making my squiggly and dot wave pattern, I go over on the top with some hatching in the same direction, focusing on darkening the base with the higher frequency of hatches to show where the shadow is strongest near the trees I've made here. Notice that the reflections of the shadows are distorted by the movement of the waves. I typically like to vary my hatching from the object and the reflection, and in this example I make the tree object lines vertical while the water lines are horizontal, but it's your preference on what you want to do. Overall, the white negative space where the hatching is not apparent still indicates the water while framing the form of the shadow reflecting from the surface. Let's try another way of hatching some waves, but this time with more movement. You can hatch and cross-hatch your waves and contour with the direction of the motion of the waves. In ocean waves, there's a certain froth and bubble that looks clearer or wider, which will indicate using negative space framing the hatching that will form each wave. Getting closer to each individual wave, there's a gradient of really high frequency hatches at the base, getting lighter until the white edges where the water bubbles up. After repeating this and varying the size of each waves, you can level the hatching in the far off waves to again make that sense of depth. The key to hatching in this technique is to have a smooth gradient for each wave that is framed by the negative space of the edge. These same concepts apply to splashes and heavier movements of water, except you have to consider how the motion of fluids changes in reaction to contact. Here's an example of a splash where an object drops straight down and the water spreads out in all directions. The base is hatched heavily at the start in conjunction with the direction of the water's movement, but then slowly has a gradient to the edge of the water, which is framed by negative white space and some dot patterns of small droplets to add some texture. Surrounding it are ripples using our first shadow method as the water moves away from the point of impact here. Now that we've mastered blocking and hatching, here's one more method for water effects. I'm going to move over onto the computer for this last one. Using tone instead of hatching, you can create a similar water effect by framing a consistent tone with negative white space. Here I'll draw the edges of the water with a white pen, and bam! To go the extra mile, you can take the edges of the white space, create a new layer, and make a darker tone to show more depth and transparency in how the water moves as it refracts light. I'm going to move it slightly to the side to finish off that effect. Using form and reflections, we can make some pretty wavy backgrounds for our manga characters to build out our worlds. I'm currently practicing by drawing a beach scene, and this will be very useful as I draw the background. In my next video, we're going to keep our head up and learn about how to draw clouds and skies using the same techniques to continue in our beach scene. But as always, I'll see you guys next time.